Welcome everyone, thank you for being here. This is going to be a wonderful treat, I think, as we all gear up for finals, to sit here and listen to two very creative people talk about their work. My name's Justin Sevenker, I'm an English professor and I'm the director of the Writing Center, so I get the pleasure of introducing these two individuals. But before I do that, I want to share some information with you folks. And all of these pamphlets and brochures and things are available right back there if you need a copy. So if you're new to the Writing Center, please pick up one of our brochures. We help everybody with essentially everything. If you're writing for English class, that's great. If you're writing for another class, that's great. If you're doing creative writing and you want somebody to take a look at it, if you're writing a resume, if you're writing a scholarship application, it doesn't matter what you're writing. If you want some help, you can come here. So feel free to pick up a brochure back there. If you are a creative writer, our English department does have a creative writing journal. This is the print version, which you can pick up back there, and there's some more copies over in the A&H office if we run out here. There's also a web presence, so you can take a look at it right online as well. We publish creative writing, nonfiction writing, and artwork as well. And Professor Kim Karshner right over there is the editor of this publication, and so after the talk today, if you have questions, you can go over and talk to Kim. I'm sure she would be extremely excited to talk to you. So please keep that in mind. If you do journalistic writing, the school newspaper, the Collegian, is always looking for students to submit work, and so feel free to take a look at this flyer right here. One of our journalism instructors back there is Jeff, right behind the desk. So if you have questions about that, you can talk to Jeff. And I have a post-it note here, so I'm just going to read this. This is from Donna. If you have questions about this, you can talk to Donna. So if you're interested in comics, writing, drawing, or the humanities in general, a new program to support students with learning communities, internships, and job opportunities is beginning next term in the spring. It's called the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Career Pilot. And so if you would like to learn more about that, please talk to Donna after the event today. So a lot of great stuff going on for creative writers and artists here at LCC. But so without further ado, let me introduce Johnny and his writing partner, Jake. Hi, Johnny. Thanks for being here. This is great. Yeah. Johnny Caputo holds an MFA in fiction writing, and he's an active member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. His speculative fiction has appeared in Mithila Review, Cast of Wonders, Allegory, and other venues. When not writing, Johnny spends his time teaching at various institutions, including ours, we're very lucky to have him, and wandering the woods around Cleveland, Ohio. And then joining us from Spain, and so again, thank you for your patience while we get the technology working. We have somebody from across the Atlantic here today, and so it takes a little doing. But this is Jake Gerard, a New York-based graphic designer and illustrator currently living abroad in Spain, who's been making comics since 2018. After self-publishing numerous comic strips over the years, and you can find a list of those on this flyer if you would like to see those, Jake had his first published comic, Nonsense Incorporated, debut on TopToonsPlus. Though he shifted his focus to working on long-form projects, Jake currently works as a colorist for WEBTOON's hit series, Live With Yourself. So if you have questions for Johnny and Jake after their presentation, I'm sure they would love to hear them. So let's welcome them and give them a hand here, folks.
Thank you, Justin, for the introduction, and thank you also, Jake, again, for coming in, and for you all for kind of dealing with us as we kind of figured out the technology, making all that work. I really appreciate your time and working with that. Ultimately, this talk today is going to be hopefully very kind of interactive, very just conversational about the art and I was going to say science, that's not the right word, but thoughts of how to go about making comics, writing comics, and what ultimately that means, and all its kind of like beautiful, glorious mess of that process. Before we jump into like our content here, we are going to just do kind of a couple of quick, brief introductions, kind of get a chance to hear from each other. There we go. Just about Jake and myself. Well, as Justin kind of briefly said, my name is Johnny Caputo. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. I work here at LCC as well as a couple other institutions. A lot of my writing interests kind of fall in the speculative and the fantastic, science fiction, fantasy, those kinds of things. I've written novels. I've written short stories, and I'm currently in the process of working with Jake and collaborating and creating a graphic novel. So again, kind of varied writing interests, mostly centered in the kind of speculative and fantastic fiction, that kind of thing. Jake, you want to take a couple words, kind of introducing yourself a little more informally here?
Sure, yeah. Happy to be here. Like the introduction said, my name is Jake Gerard. I do a lot of comics like with Johnny, but I'm also a graphic designer. And my main clientele is children's entertainers like magicians, people who do foam parties and stuff like that. So I've really carved out a niche where I get to do a lot of fun design and writing and drawing.
Cool. Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it. What we're largely going to be talking about today, as you can kind of see our agenda here, first and foremost, we're going to talk about how comics really can be anything. It's a very wide, very diverse art form. So we're going to hit that first. Then we're going to talk about essentially like the process. What does it mean to make comics, and how do you kind of find a starting point, so to speak? After that, we're going to talk about particularly options for like scripting, like how do you go about actually creating a script, because it's potentially messier than it sounds, and also what are some strategies and things to kind of keep in mind while you are scripting your comic. After that, we're going to do the bulk of the work, and looking at, once you have a script in place, how do you go from that script to an actual final product? We're going to look like essentially a page step by step from script all the way up to final product there. Lastly, we'll talk about publication options and also kind of survival strategies for how to continue doing this in a kind of a system and a setup where it can be difficult to want to kind of continue to build that motivation, especially if your ultimate goal is publication. That can be hard to kind of continue that motivation, if you will. This is kind of our general agenda here going forward. All right. When it comes to, we're going to start here with the endless possibilities of comics. First couple thing to kind of talk about like distinction is this idea between short form comics and long form comics. All right. As we kind of mentioned in our intros here, my general expertise is in longer form comics, things that are either graphic novel length or longer. Jake is also kind of in that field, but is also doing some longer work or other work, and has done some significant work in short form kind of thing. So Jake, do you mind just kind of talking a little bit about like what short form comics are and kind of what your work and those look like?
Sure. So I think a good way to think about a lot of modern web comics is that they're essentially like the comic strips you'd see in the newspapers, like Garfield, stuff like that. But now with the advent of social media and how accessible a lot of these digital art software programs are, it's super saturated now, where everyone can start making, it's a lot more accessible to make gag comics. Where with long form stuff, you're more focused on, say, like narrative and story arcs. Gag comics pretty much always come down to the punchline or punchlines, depending on if you're going with a 4 or 6 panel kind of structure. So, the best way I would think about that is kind of like the funny papers and stuff like that in terms of short forms.
Cool. And then by comparison, long form is kind of more like you sound as in the name, your longer forms of comics, either like a single short story in like 20 to 30 pages, or going up to even to graphic novels, multi-issue arcs, that kind of thing. So again, even with that being said, it's hard to kind of say what comics really is because it's such a diverse media. That also goes for the publishing options. There are absolutely publishing in print is very much a possibility. It's kind of a process to do to kind of crack into that industry. But as Jake mentioned, with the advent of social media and a lot of different online platforms, which we'll talk about, when I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with here, publishing your comics is pretty accessible and able to do, if you wanted to start tomorrow, you could kind of start that process. That doesn't mean essentially like easier, you're going to quote unquote find success, whatever that means to you. But ultimately, you have a variety of options. And like once you have made a comic, getting it out there, which means that there's all kinds of people making all kinds of stuff. Okay. As I mentioned too, there's kind of this spectrum. Like there are some comics that are incredibly realistic, very like literary, if you will, about just memoirs, almost people's kind of like life, their kind of experiences going through things, all the way up to incredibly fantastical, speculative, science fiction, fantasy, those sorts of things. Jake, anything else you want to add here about kind of like just possibilities, like of what comics are or is in this kind of current day and age?
I think an interesting thing too, in terms of like long versus short form, a lot of what you'll see on platforms like online publications that we'll talk about, they're kind of a middle ground, like a mid form even. Now that I think about it, where you'll have, episodes of comics that are say like, 20 to 30 panels that release kind of bi-weekly, stuff like that. So like when Johnny says a spectrum, truly, it's not as simple as a binary, long and short.
Right. So again, I think this kind of goes back and just kind of further illustrates the point that really, when it comes to making comics, the possibilities like really are endless and really only bounded some of, I think, but like your audience's expectations of whatever genre you're working in, but also, and probably more importantly, by like your imagination, what it is that you want to create. So that being said, I alluded to earlier before the start of this that like I'm going to ask you to write a little bit right now, and this is the time I'm going to ask you to do that. So if you have some kind of device or notebook you want to work in, we're just going to take a quick 3 minutes, okay? And I'm going to ask you all briefly to kind of just write about one of the following 2 prompts. Either one, what sorts of comics do you enjoy? What kinds of comics do you like read and consume just now as a person, as a reader? And what do you like about them? What about those comics are like enjoyable to you, okay? If you don't currently like read comics or just don't want to worry about that one, your other option is if you could snap your fingers right now and like create an original comic here in this room, what would it be? What would it be about? What might it look like? What kind of maybe potential characters? Essentially, use these to kind of let your brain run wild. Don't stop yourself. Don't edit yourself. Just take the next 3 minutes, get some writing done, and then we'll kind of use this as a way to kind of kick off our conversation. I will be asking for some volunteers, and we'll see how that goes.
That'll be good for me too.
Yeah, 100%. Cool. All right, I'm going to ask for some audience participation here if people are interested in sharing. If you're not interested in sharing, that's also fine. There's no pressure to it. I ultimately kind of want to see what ideas we have, what ideas are kind of floating out there, and ultimately how the things that you're kind of thinking about right now might connect into the presentation you're about to hear. So if anybody wants to kind of kick us off, feel free to just throw a hand up. I'll ask that you just briefly say your name and kind of just talk about what you wrote about here. Go ahead, kick us off.
My name's Adam Benson.
Adam, good to meet you.
You too. I put 3 comics. I went with Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. I'm going to get this term wrong. I might get this term wrong, I'm sorry, but what are they called? One-shots?
Okay, like a one-shot? Yeah.
Batman one-shots and the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Okay.
What I like about Johnny is the dark humor and like the artwork Vasquez does for those books.
Yeah.
And for Turtles and Batman, I grew up with them, so but I didn't grow up with the comics. I grew up with the show, so I went and discovered the comics.
Right.
Like I thought the artwork was great and stuff, and especially Arkham Asylum. I think
Yeah.
it's a really pretty book.
Right. Can you say the name of the first book you mentioned again?
Oh, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac.
Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. Okay, so Adam talked about Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, Batman, especially Arkham Asylum, and also Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics is kind of like especially focusing on the artwork, kind of bring them into the genre. Cool. Yeah, a hand back here as well, right?
Yeah, I kind of split them up into different areas where I consume them.
Yeah.
WEBTOON, manga, and the online area, which would be maybe Instagram.
Yeah.
So I'll give one each. WEBTOON, I like Lore Olympus for the stylization and the character interaction.
Cool.
For like Instagram, that's where I mainly consume a gag comic called Nerd and Jock.
Okay.
And I like the style, the humor, and the character interactions, and I also like manga. An example of that would be One Punch Man. That would be
Cool.
The style, the character designs, the flow, the movement of the paneling. Yeah, that's basically it. So for me, it comes down to compelling characters, good design, humor, and an overall captivation design.
Cool. And can I catch your name real quick?
Drew.
So Drew kind of just told us about his interest in webtoons, Instagram comics, and also manga. I guess a lot of kind of ideas about like what the stylization, all kind of different elements of humor that you're interested in as well. Cool.
I threw a lot at you, sorry.
No, it's all good. This is getting practicing my paraphrasing skills. This is good. Yeah. Go ahead. Get in the back here, then we'll come over next. All right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. We'll get you here. And then 1, 2, 3. We'll go that way. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
My name is Davion. I'm personally a big fan of shonen battle manga.
Cool.
Like he said, One Punch Man, Bleach, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Mainly because of how the art and how the art can pretty much elevate the story that's being told. There's something about the way how the art can really push how well the story can be, and it can elevate ideas and concepts that usually take some time to imagine just reading in a regular novel.
Right.
There's something really important about that. And
Yeah.
That's what I enjoy the most about most comics or manga.
Cool. So Davion told us about his interest in shonen battle manga and how really it kind of really takes the ideas that would take a lot of time and space to develop in like a regular novel or a written novel. The art kind of push that and elevate in that some ways. And kind of interaction between words and art. Good. In the back corner here, you had something. Then we'll go over here next. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Aaron. So for me, mine is more broader. Mine is more of all DC and Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my comic knowledge comes from those because I grew up with those.
Right.
I think my love for that is mostly because it's what the characters symbolize about humanity and society.
Cool.
And a lot of what good can come out of it. It also comes down to, like, I guess, the relatability, where you can put yourself into these characters. And also, it just takes me out of this mode into another mode whenever I get too stressed or depressed about what's going on in this world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it makes it mean, it can make people feel more powerful and more good.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what comes down to
Good.
for me.
Yeah, really well said. Aaron told us about his kind of like going with kind of the big two, DC and Marvel, and how there's an element of like character relatability, but also like escapism in some ways, kind of like feeling free, feeling powerful from the nonsense that is our world. Really good stuff. Go ahead. We'll hear you last but not least over here. Oh, actually, okay, we'll end up with you in the front. Go ahead. We'll get you next. Yeah. Yeah, you got it.
My name is Debbie. I like horror and goth comics, and my favorites are Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, I Feel Sick, Invader Zim, and all of the Silent Hill comics. Basically, the bloodier the better.
Nice. Sum up what Devi just told us. Horror goth comics, the bloodier the better. Our second Johnny the Homicidal Maniac mentioned today. Good stuff. Go ahead. Last but not least, we'll hear from the front here.
My name's Shelly. I've been reading Chainsaw Man as of the moment.
Nice.
The less conventional storytelling, because stuff really carries weight.
Yeah.
And I like how it's not so polished like most of the manga and comics out in the greater space.
Yeah.
Like sketchy kind of, sort of.
Right. Yeah. So Shelly was telling us about you said Chainsaw Man, right? Yeah, and then kind of like the almost like the stylism, the artistic choice to like essentially make it like sketchier or kind of grittier in some ways, and not it be as clean or polished and that kind of thing. Yeah. Go ahead. You want something you want to add real quick?
Interesting
Yeah.
about Chainsaw Man is its emphasis on cinematics in the manga. Like, it almost feels like you're watching a movie while you're reading it. The way like the panels are set up and stuff.
Yeah.
Like there's like a specific conversation that they're having, and it feels like it's like snap zoomed in.
Right.
It's really fascinating.
Like the real like cinematography that's happening on the panels, that kind of thing. Yeah. Really good stuff. So again, I think ultimately, just from hearing even the kind of conversation that we're having in this room right now, there's so many different diverse comics out there, and also so many different types and styles and kind of reasons to be into and thoughts about it. Okay. Ultimately, what we're going to talk about today is kind of like Jake and our process, our kind of collaborative process, how we go about doing some stuff, but also know that this is just one way. This is just one way that you can engage with creating comics, and it's also meant in the kind of thing, in some ways, to be an incredibly as much as possible collaborative kind of way, because really that's ultimately, I think, like Dave and you hit on as well, comics is about not just words, not just art, but like how can these things kind of work together to create a new, compelling, interesting story that maybe you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So that being said, we are going to kind of move on to this process of making comics, like how to go about actually doing this. Okay, you'll see kind of a quick overview. You have script writing, and then once you have written the script, which again is like arguably the first step. You could probably call like brainstorming actually like thinking the idea the first step, but like that's a different story, right? We have so many steps after you actually have written the script. You have sketches, inking, flats, aka your base coloring, shading and lighting, and then lettering coming up after that, okay? All these different steps that go into like making a really well put together comic. And again, obviously not all comics will go about using all these steps, but these are kind of things that you know can kind of be in your toolkit, so to speak. So we're just gonna kind of hit these in order, if you will, and also talk about how while depending on how you make comics, whether you are a solo like artist, writer, individual, or if you have working with a team, all of these are parts of writing comics. All these are parts of making comics. There's never really a part where it's like, all right, I did my thing, you do yours, and let's stop talking about it. It's always a back and forth kind of collaborative conversation about how can we make and tell the story that we're trying to tell here. Okay, Jake, any thoughts you want to share here before we jump into like the actual like scripting process and stuff like that?
Yeah, I'd say writing the script and the sketches are probably the most intensive on your brain. Because, it takes a lot to pull any kind of story out of nothingness, right? Like, to give it form at first, So I've found, especially Johnny, you can relate to, but I'm sure, like, the scripts will do a couple versions, and even the sketches, I'll go back and I'll revise. And I usually dread the sketches the most because it takes the most strain on my brain to put it all on the paper. And that as on the art side of things, I found that once you get over that hump, you can throw on a podcast, music, something like that, and then you can get into that flow state for the rest of it.
Right, but like if you're right, like the brain kind of intensity, the labor, mental labor comes really in those first two sketches, or first two steps, as kind of like we're taking nothingness and creating something out of it. Cool. Yeah, really well said. So hopping on to scripting, we're just gonna kind of hit a brief, quick like crash course in story structure. This is nothing that's crazy intensive, nothing super like advanced or academic. Just kind of a quick crash course. We can kind of like talk about some basic things going forward. Also, just two pieces of information that I forgot to mention. One, Jake, just so you have kind of a vibe here, there's like probably 15, 17 people or so in the room right now. Lots of people are like writing stuff and like drawing things. It's cool. For you all, just a heads up, if you wrote your email down on the sign-in sheet, you will have access to this. So there's like links and stuff you'll be able to click on. Don't feel like you need to get everything down word for word because you will have access to this PowerPoint. We'll be able to send that out to you, okay? When it comes to story structure, really, when it comes to like plotting a story, right? The plot of stories is made up of different events, okay? And there are multiple kind of ways, again, more than just these two, but two kind of basic ways to think about how the plot in a story happens. You have an and then story in which you just have events that happen, and there's not really a direct connection between them. We have event 1, we have event 2, we have event 3, and they kind of just happen because that's what's going to happen, all right? You also have what's known as a because story, in which what happens or occurs in event 1 leads to direct consequences or results in like what's going to happen in event 2. There's kind of a direct what we know as causation between one event and the next, all right? Now, again, inherently, one of these stories is not better than the other, but they are just kind of different types and kinds of stories that you might be able to kind of tell based on what it is you're trying to get or dive into here. Jake, anything you want to kind of jump in about like story structure here?
I guess I could give a quick snapshot into like gag comics, in the sense that most of the time you're not telling a story, you're telling a joke. Right. So if your goal is to do like a comedy strip or something like that, you have a lot of the joke craft is zigging when people think you're going to zag and doing stuff like that to set up punchlines. So it very much you're building up to one panel essentially.
Gotcha. You're building up like kind of there's a setup building up to that punchline panel. These are the kind of like do something unexpected or humorous in that kind of way. Cool. Good. Love it. Kind of building off story structure, then we'll get into the actual like scripting process. One last slide here is that if you are writing what's known as a because story, right? This kind of like one event happens and that leads to some kind of decision or consequences that can build out. This is kind of again, it's a formula, it's a structure. Like anything else, this is not like anything that you need to follow strictly, but it can be helpful if you're like, I'm not sure how to start or what my next move in the story could be. This can be a formula to kind of help you consider what might my next option be, all right? Again, it's written very generally, very generic, but it can be used as a helpful guide here. Scene 1, we want to kind of like what this character wants, and also what is the first decision or like that they have to make or thing that happens to them, okay? Out of that decision or thing that happens to them will yield some kind of consequences. That's always a good question to ask yourself. Because the character decided to buy an apple instead of an orange, what does that mean for the rest of their day? How might that change what happens in the next scene? And then you can kind of just rinse, repeat sort of thing. In the second scene, we have consequences from that first scene or first moment in the story, and how does that lead to a moment of consequence or decision that the character then can kind of like have to make another relevant decision. Ultimately, making characters kind of like make decisions is what can make a comic or really any story like relatable, because people, you and I, have to make decisions like every day, right? And so seeing a character have to go through that process can help like readers really kind of connect with that sort of idea. And ultimately what you're leading towards in like a kind of a short story or graphic novel is some kind of climactic scene. Whether you have 3 scenes, 5 scenes, 12 scenes, doesn't really matter. You're leading to some kind of climactic scene where the character is going to make some kind of decision or choice that ultimately shows some sort of either change in them or lack of change, when maybe they could have or should have changed in some kind of way, okay? So again, these are just kind of real quick crash course story structure things to kind of think about, keep in mind as you're kind of creating characters, creating stories, whether you are writing gag comics or like long form stuff. These kind of things like what kind of decisions are my characters going to be making and how might this affect their actions can be good, kind of useful things to think about in like the scripting process, okay? Anything else you want to add there, Jake, about like kind of just general scenes, story making, that kind of thing?
No, I think that's definitely more your domain, I think.
Totally fair, yeah. All right. We're going to jump into the actual scripting process now. And the beautiful and terrible thing about comic scripts is that it's like, I'm assuming y'all have taken like English 1 or English 161 or are in that process of like, you have to like MLA format. You have to like have your title, header up in here. You have to have your citations, all that kind of stuff. The wonderful and terrible thing about comics is that, oh, sorry, I'm showing you weird stuff on my screen. That doesn't exist. There is no like agreed upon universal form for like, this is what a comic script needs to look like, okay? If you're writing for like scripts for like movies and TV shows, that does exist. But in comics, the beautiful thing is about like the script is not the final product. The script is basically a note to the rest of the comics team if you're working with someone else, or to yourself when you come back to like draw the actual thing, if you're an artist writer kind of combo, if you will. All right. So the beautiful thing is you can make this a document that works best for you in whatever form that looks like. All right. Especially if you are like and again, Jake, I'm actually gonna kind of throw the ball to your court here. Instead of like just making a script that is really just like notes or thumbnails, where it's not even like a full-bodied script in any kind of way. It's more like, all right, I am the one who's going to be drawing this at some point. I am a writer and an artist, so I don't need to like give myself the full dialogue. I just need to kind of make some notes for myself. What might this page look like? What kind of like face is this character be making? This almost can be like a visual script in some ways, where you're kind of like making quick notes for yourself or showing that sort of thing. So I'm curious, Jake, do you have any kind of experience, especially working on like Jake Fights the Void and your kind of short form stuff? What was your kind of like scripting process like for that process?
Well, in the very beginning, I just went at it with no real planning. And something you learn, from doing it is that something I started doing is think like storyboards, if you guys have ever seen for like animation or stuff like that. For a lot of the gag strips, that's what I started doing. You make one template file that just has the 4 panels in the square format or something like that, and start sketching. And then for me, it would always be the art first, and then the dialogue second, because that's how my brain works. I'm an artist first before I'm a writer. Right. So for me, that ended up being the best way to go about it. And that's something that I think is going to be different for everybody.
Right. So just to kind of make my point here, like if I'm hearing you right, you said like your writing process was to make the art first. That was how you started writing these gags. Yeah. I think that's an important thing to know. That writing a comic doesn't just mean I'm going to write the script and then pass it to somebody else. It is a collaborative thing, either with yourself or because it's ultimately an interplay between words and pictures, right? That's what we're doing here. So I think that's an important thing to kind of look at and know. If you are in the process of like working with other people or working with a team of writers or team of like creators, there are a couple things that are like, again, kind of like more generally practiced. But again, these are still just notes for the artist. Like I know when Jake and I are kind of, I'm giving Jake the script, I will literally say things like, Jake, I don't know what this panel should look like. What ideas do you have? It doesn't have to be like a fully fleshed out thing. I'll obviously give as much work as I can because I want to take that load off of Jake. But it is like a note between me and him. It's kind of that conversation. So there's something known as the Marvel method, in which if you're writing like a long form, like multi-page comic, instead of like describing what's happening in each panel or in each like specific section, you'll just describe what happens on one page. This single page, what needs to happen, what character is doing what has to be happening by the end of this page to make sure the story can kind of move and go forward. All right. That's again known as the Marvel method. It's kind of like you're not necessarily writing even like full scripts of dialogue. You're just kind of saying on this page, here's like a summary of what's going to happen. And that kind of leaves the artist with some more like work to do, but also some more autonomy to kind of apply their own freedom and skill to like see how can we make these cool ideas into a particular page layout, that kind of thing. The kind of script that Jake and I generally use is known as the full script, in which the writer does kind of describe each panel, what's going to happen, what the first panel is going to look like, what the second panel is going to look like, so on and so forth, like what's going to happen in that panel, and also who is saying what, or what kind of dialogue is going on in that particular panel. So you're going to see an example of this in a moment, but ultimately you kind of have some different levels. And again, these are just 3 options. There's really, I think making a comic script is as freeing as like creating anything that you want, as long as you have some kind of format to like keep yourself sane, to keep track of your ideas is kind of the important thing here. All right. All right. We're going to go ahead and move on to things about like things to kind of like keep in mind when you're scripting. All right. One is this idea of an establishing shot. And Jake, do you mind if I actually throw this to you? Because this is definitely like your area of expertise. You've done a lot of like really cool stuff with establishing shots just in the comic we're working on, as well as like your own work.
Yeah, so like a big thing with establishing shots is that by establishing the space that the characters are in, you then have a lot more wiggle room and leeway with how much of that you're going to showcase in further panels. Because the reader, the audience, has a clear idea of where everyone is because you've shown the space. So it goes an incredibly long way in contextualizing your areas, your sets, your scenes, stuff of that nature.
Cool. Yeah, so the idea is that, like, in that first panel on a page, usually like the first panel of any comic you're going to read, not everyone across the board, but a lot of comics will do this. They'll show you like a zoomed out, almost overhead view of where are we, right? And the idea, like Jake is saying, is if you can do that for your readers, then you don't necessarily have to do much more background work in the other panels because your reader has a pretty good idea of like where we are and what the overall setting, what the overall vibe is. That's known as an establishing shot, okay? Pacing is also a really important thing to keep in mind. And this is like how quickly or slowly an individual page is going to read, okay? Again, some tools you have in your toolkit here are like the number of words you're going to use and also the kinds of images you're going to use. Generally, if you have like a lot of panels with like very few words, that can read pretty quickly and almost give a sense of like momentum or action to the story. All right. On the flip of that, if you have like a lot of words and a lot of panels, that's probably going to slow things down for your reader. Also, the idea of like having a large image that is like incredibly detailed and nuanced can also slow things down to kind of have your reader like almost like look at and get a feel for like what is happening and like really enjoy what's kind of going on in that particular image. The point here is that there is like fast pacing or slow pacing isn't like inherently better or worse. It all comes down to like what kind of emotion are you trying to create in a given scene, in a given moment for your reader. There are some pages where you probably want your reader to be like moving quickly. An action scene is a great example. There are probably also other times where you want your reader to kind of like slow down and either feel the emotional impact of something or like just kind of sit in a moment for a second. So this idea of like being aware of how many words and the kinds of words you're using and also this like the kind of actual like layout of your pages to kind of create those intentional effects for your reader is important. Jake, what kind of thoughts do you have on pacing here?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. You know, like generally pages that are more text heavy, more dialogue heavy, they're going to slow your reader down a bit. You know, and also you can also get slower pacing with panels that have no dialogue. You know, sometimes the absence of it, of just setting a scene and setting an atmosphere, can be enough to, it almost in a way signifies to the reader like, oh, take a breath.
Right.
Take whatever just happened and stuff like that.
Yeah. Actually think, has anyone ever read Saga I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay, yeah. If you haven't read it, it's probably my favorite comic of all time. It's just like science fantasy, probably the best way to say it. It's basically Romeo and Juliet in the middle of like an intergalactic war. It's incredible. It's so good, all right? But there's a scene that happens, I think it's towards like the end of the fourth arc, something like that, where this really terrible, atrocious thing happens at like near the end of an issue. And then the next like 4 pages are just black. Like black pages to kind of make you as a reader sit with that and be like, oh my God, that was so horrible. Like that was really bad. Like that was a choice that when the writer wrote the script was just like 4 black pages. It's not an accident. That is an intentional choice. The writer's like forcing you to kind of sit with that horrible thing that happened. Yeah. Last on this one is the rule of 28. This is just kind of to keep, again, if you are a writer working with an artist, keep your artist sane, your letterer sane, because if you try to fit more than 28 words in a panel, especially if it's like kind of a normal sized panel, you can do it, but it just gets really crowded and really kind of clustered, if you will. So you want to try and keep whatever like dialogue, whatever letters are going to be on the page actually, you want to keep that kind of tight to 28 words or less so that you're not trying to force everything in. There's actually space for like the images to show, that kind of thing, okay? Couple less things to think about with script, and then we'll get ready to go into our actual like looking at kind of the process here. Page turns. And I think there's also a gag concept that like how you kind of flow from one panel to the next is really important, especially in like a longer form comic. You're probably going to be having your reader turn the page either by clicking on it or by like physically turning the page in the book. This is a great chance for you as a writer, as an artist, to like give your reader that hook. What is the question you can almost ask in that last panel to make your reader want to continue to read through and kind of see what the possibilities are in that next one? And then the last one is this idea of splash panels or even splash pages. Jake, you want to kind of describe what that looks like, what that is here?
Sure. It's and it actually ties back into what we say with pacing. Is that if you as a combo of artist or writer and artist are devoting an entire page to one panel, one large panel, that's going to make the reader sit there for a second. And take it in what's there, whether it's a battle scene or even just a reveal of a character or something like that. The amount of real estate you give that image gives it weight. You know, really lets you show emphasis on something.
Cool. Good. And actually, we're going to see an example, not of a splash page, but of a splash panel in just a couple slides here. All right. So that being said, I want to show you an example script that I wrote, co-wrote with Jake, and sent off to him. This is you kind of see a weird cutout there. Sorry about that. This is page 9 of the project that Jake and I are currently working on. It's a science fantasy also comic. It's kind of like young adult, middle grade, science fantasy comic. It's called The Ballad of Lumberjackson. It's about these two brothers who essentially, one of them accidentally breaks time, and they have to kind of try and figure out how to fix that. So this script here you're seeing from page 9, it's pretty early in the comic, and we kind of see how this works as far as like the full script model goes. We have here a description of like what the art looks like, what is going to be essentially happening in this panel. Law, who is a character, scrambles out of a giant hole in the ground that was left by the blast. There was a talking about page turns, a bomb went off at the end of the previous page. Just kind of see what happens, right? His sheathed laser machete is tucked into his belt, and his hood is pulled up. This is kind of what the reader would see looking at the art. Essentially, this is the note. Jake, I want you to draw this, okay? And then from here, we have the dialogue. Who's going to be saying what? There's going to be a word bubble coming from Law saying, come on, Langston, it's gaining. And then Langston, who is not in the panel, noted by off panel, wait, I totally have something for this, okay? So you kind of see the structure of this is I just kind of said, here's what the first panel should look like. Here's what the words are going to be. And then here's what the second panel is going to look like. Here's what those words and sound effects are going to be, that sort of thing. So essentially, this kind of just comes down. This actually is not the entirety of the script for this page. There's actually one more panel that I just couldn't fit realistically in the actual screenshot here, so I apologize about that. But just kind of what a full script of a comic would look like. That, again, is just kind of my note to Jake. This is, again, is not by any means the only way to do this. This is kind of the way that we've worked, kind of figured out, like, all right, here's a description, and also here is kind of what the characters are going to be saying at that point. Jake, do you have any kind of thoughts or things you want to add about like either kind of like your process in like writing the script, or even like kind of like what it's like when you receive one of these things?
Typically, as an artist, when I receive like scripts from you, I read the whole page. I always read a page at a time. I'll read the whole thing all the way through, of course, first. But when it comes to starting sketches, it's important to have like going back to even like the Marvel method a little bit, where it's like, what's everything that needs to happen on this page? And that's how I decide, like panel hierarchy, which ones are going to be the biggest, which ones will be the smallest. And that's when I start to piece together how I want to divide the page up before I even start sketching it.
Right, so you're kind of like seeing the panels, like making decisions, like which is going to be the biggest, smallest. I think every now and then I'll leave a note like this panel should be splashy or something like that. But the layout of the page is something that you, just with your expertise, definitely like are just better at. So therefore, like take the lead on to kind of figure out what's going to be oriented where, that kind of thing. Cool. With that, I'm going to talk a lot less, and I'm going to let Jake take over, because now that you've seen the script, we now get to kind of see what happens going from script to like what are the steps involved in like developing this final page here. All right. So again, Jake, I'm not throwing you the wolves here. Feel free to kind of call me out, ask me questions here. But I'm going to kind of ask you, almost like talk through the process of like, you're seeing here we have the first step, which is sketches, and our second step, which is lines. You kind of talk about like going from script to sketches to lines here.
Sure. And I know people are talking about like, my art is much more nerd and jock style than it is One Punch Man or Chainsaw Man. I'm very much more of a cartoony kind of guy. But, something I try to keep in mind when I start sketching is how much dialogue is in a panel. As you can see with kind of the mock bubbles I've put in there for the page. Because that affects composition, because you need to account for that space, so then that could involve revising an idea for a cool panel you have, but you'll have to adjust it because you really have to account for those words. And that's part of that collaborative conversation Johnny talks about too, where it's like accounting for everything in the conversation, the back and forth that happens there, where it's like, oh, maybe we need to cut down the dialogue on this panel. Or if we make the characters smaller, we'll have more room for that crucial bit of information or exposition. So that's a lot of what goes into the sketching. You know, at the bottom of this page, we even see an example of a splash panel that we've included for that big almost reveal at the bottom. So, yeah, I mean, but once you go from sketches to lines, like, there's a lot less decision making that's happening at that point as an artist. So for me, a lot of people, you know, in the industry that I talk to, they hate inking. I love it because I don't have to think about doing it. You know, it's, for me, it's fun. I like drawing the lines. The hardest part for me is over at that point, going from the sketch to the lines.
Cool. Love it. After your lines, you're going to be looking at starting the coloring and kind of lighting and shading process. You want to kind of walk us through here as well?
Sure. So the first thing in any kind of, once you get past the lines, the first step is flats, which is essentially blocking out your colors before you're adding shading or like additional details, stuff like that, which is good for people to, like, you know, especially in the digital age, to magic wand it if you're passing it off to someone else. It's easy for the next person on the team to grab the colors as a whole block and adjust them like that. The biggest difference you'll see here is that between the flats and the rendering, you know, with the flats, you don't get the as much of a contrast between the top panels and the bottom. But as you can see, what I did in the background of this page was put that gradient brush over the top half of the page so that the bottom half will pop off the top panels better.
Cool. Good stuff. And then our last slide here, kind of going through the entire process here, is looking at adding the letters. Actually getting the letters in to kind of see what this final full page looks like and how it kind of ultimately is meant to, like, kind of tell a story, follow your eyes, that sort of thing. Jake, any kind of thoughts or ideas on kind of the lettering process here?
If you're an artist who's doing it from start to finish, this is the easiest step to get burnt out on, you know, because you've already done the sketching, the line work, the flats, the rendering. But this part's just as important. You know, like, if I were to stress anything, or to not get lazy on the lettering side of things. Because it's important for your text to be consistent, for the bubbles to be consistent. You know, and the nice part about it is that it is an overlay over everything else. So after the art's done, the typography and the lettering, it's the most malleable part.
Kind of change it, tweak it, make it fit to what's there, and that kind of thing. Cool. Okay, good. And so that really, again, is a really condensed version of the depth of the process, to be totally fair and honest here. Because ultimately it's a lot of work to kind of go from creating a raw script to then making it into something that does exist. There's a lot of kind of steps and time that goes into that. Once you have done that, and you've, like, done that either for your strip or for, like, the story you're trying to make, you can then really start talking about and thinking about your options for, like, publication, like where and how, if you want to. Because ultimately, to be totally clear and honest here, you could make comics just to make them. You don't have your goal. Publication does not have to be your goal by any kind of means. You can just make it just to make it, right? But if publication is your goal, it is important to kind of know and think about the different options that you have here. Okay, we're going to talk largely about just kind of two, like, broad categories and kind of go into a little bit further specifics from there. One being self-publishing, meaning you are publishing your comics, like, by yourself. You're not going through a company or an agent to do so. Or traditional publishing, in which you are looking for a literary agent who will essentially represent you and then try and sell your comic to, like, publishing companies. It's kind of the distinction between self-publishing and traditional publishing. Okay, general breakdown: self-publishing, you have a lot more control and, like, creative freedom over the process because you're not responsible to anybody but you. But that means you also have to do, like, a lot more work. You have to do, like, essentially all your promotion, all your marketing, all that stuff, really just even, like, designing different, like, elements of the cover, that kind of stuff, that comes back down to you. So there's a lot of other skills besides just, like, writing and art that go into self-publishing as far as, like, the salesmanship of it, okay? Traditional publishing, someone is generally doing that work for you. Like, a literary agent will, like, help, like, actually sell your book to an editor, and they will probably have you some kind of marketing and stuff like that. But largely, they have teams to help with that. With that being said, though, it is and can be very difficult to like kind of crack into that traditional publishing. To find a literary agent takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. You have to write these horrible things called query letters, which if you don't know what they are, stay away from them. They're so hard and just very, very difficult to do, but also a very necessary part of the process here. Jake, you want to kind of throw in any thoughts here about self-publishing versus traditional, kind of your knowledge on the differences?
Yeah, I mean, with self-publishing, especially like if you're posting on Instagram, WEBTOON, something like that, it's important to go in with the expectation that, especially in the beginning, you're a drop in the bucket. Like we said, like a big part, I'd say one of the biggest cons of self-publishing is the saturation of social media.
Yeah.
And we'll get more into this with like sustainability and avoiding burnout, but like the algorithms crave consistency. So another part of that self-publishing thing is having a consistent output, I'd say, to really build a following, and I think a lot of people oscillate between these two where, they spend their time learning their craft, self-publishing, just getting work out there. And once they've built up a following, then it makes, I think, like Johnny was saying, traditional publishing is harder. I think by building your own following before you get to that side of it can help make it a little bit easier. You'll have more or less clout with a publishing company.
Right. Yeah. I think just to kind of fully jump off that point as well, like I want to be clear, both of these are just they're not there's not an easy route to like do this and essentially get paid for it, right? It's a difficult thing to do. It's by no means impossible, but it is difficult. I think it's important to know that. Even if you are self-publishing, I think some will kind of get into like our survival strategies. Like it may take years to kind of build the kind of following where you are consistently getting even some kind of income for it. And I think that's an important point to know that I think we'll kind of get into our survival strategies as well, is that like it is important to know that this is a thing you should want to do first and foremost, and kind of have this idea that if you never got paid for doing this, you'd still be okay doing it, right? I think ultimately if you are kind of going into comics to try and like make money on comics and like looking for that success to happen right now, it can be tough, right? It can be very difficult to kind of almost like setting your expectations pretty high, and as Jake said, in a really saturated market. So kind of like knowing that this is a thing that you're going to do because you can't stop doing it. You're going to want to do it. Doesn't mean you're not going to find success, but it's going to help you kind of like give you that motivation to kind of continue when it is difficult. Or when I think, as Jake said earlier, like when social media or like your kind of lack of recognition starts to make you feel small, you can be like, okay, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm doing this still. Okay. With that being said, I think we're going to move actually into our kind of like survival strategies. Like you've made some comics, you're making comics, you're starting to kind of like get a feel for this. How do you keep doing it? Because there are going to be, just full transparency, pressures, realities that make it hard to continue doing it, whether it's like school, work, job, pressure from yourself, pressure from somewhere else. It can be hard to continue this process. We're gonna talk about here some strategies of like how to go about building and continuing your motivation going forward, right? Jake, you want to jump into that first one about like balance of what you're doing here?
Sure. So I would say this probably, the first bullet point is geared more towards gag or short form strips, where it's easier for you to capitalize on trends. Because in terms of growing a following, you need to get people's eyes on it. And that'll often entail, making a comic about whatever just happened in current events or something like that. So you have to strike this balance between like, oh, well, what are the jokes I want to tell? But almost what are some of the jokes that I need to tell? And I don't think that speaks to any kind of lack of integrity to try and trend surf. In a lot of ways, in the current social media landscape, you'll need to a degree. But you still have that choice on what trend you're going to surf. Like for me, a lot of the stuff that helped me gain a following in the beginning were video game related comics. That's something I'm passionate about. So even though I'm capitalizing on like, oh, like people are talking about this thing from Elden Ring or something from this Sonic game, that's still stuff I'm interested in, but I'm using it to that trendy advantage.
Yeah, you're using like what you're gonna write anyways to kind of like tap into a trend that might be out there. Cool. I think this goes really well into the second point, which again, I'm gonna kind of just briefly talk on and then hit it back to you. Is this like idea of like, oh, I don't want to make it because it's already been done, or like I've seen that 1,000 times. Doesn't necessarily mean that like you still can't make it, because guess what? like reading and like consuming stuff is a great way to get ideas. And it doesn't mean you should like obviously plagiarize or rip off of somebody else, but it does mean that like you should kind of be aware of your influences and like try to make that your own in some kind of ways. Jake, I think you said this like really well the other day. You want to kind of jump into this, like this idea of like how to kind of use this to your advantage?
Yeah, I think I don't know if any of you are familiar with the webcomic artist Alsbard. He's pretty big on Reddit. And something I've talked to him about is that he'll have an idea for a comic, and he'll look it up, and he's like, "Oh, Shen's done this, Sarah Anderson's done this," like. So he won't do it. And I don't know if that's always the best mentality to take, because especially if you're starting out, it's good to go through those motions. Relatable comics are relatable for a reason. And they're a great place for you to learn your own craft and find your own way of expressing that shared experience between people. So I don't think you should ever, gatekeep yourself from creating something just because someone else has used a similar concept.
Absolutely. I think take all this. I'm actually going to say this out loud and then kick it back to you, Jake, because I think this is actually like a direct quote. Jake and I met earlier this week, kind of talk about stuff here. I think I should actually put this in quotes, because I think, Jake, you said this word for word. To use social media as a tool, but be wary of its potential to make you feel small. Do you want to kind of just talk about what that is or what that might look like?
Yeah. So like we said, like you are just dropping a comic on Instagram is a drop in the bucket. And you may see someone that you're like, oh, their art's not as good as mine, or their writing isn't as sharp, but they're blowing up. And it's dangerous to conflate the quality of your work with how it's performing on social media. There is something to be said for something being popular, whether it's through how accessible it is, the simplicity of the style, something like that. But it's not always. It's never necessarily one-to-one. I've seen people blow up way faster than other people. And I don't want to say there's no rhyme or reason, but it's just like, oh, this style caught on at this moment. And I think, Johnny, you had said there's almost a lottery aspect to it.
Yeah.
In terms of blowing up on social media.
Right. And I think kind of both these things are worth saying, like, not in a sense of like, oh my God, it's just going to be depressing the entire time. Because that's not the case here. I think the goal here is that, like, I think you said it too, like there's this idea of like there's a lottery element to it. Like you need to kind of make your lottery ticket to like get out there to see if it is going to blow up or if it is going to be like successful by like popular standards. But you get to make your lottery tickets. This is kind of the cool part. You get to kind of see and decide like what is it going to look like to make it interesting and make you want to keep coming back to it. Which I think goes back to Jake's original point about like making stuff you want to make, because that's going to be what kind of brings you back in a lot of those ways. Similarly, you mentioned, Jake, earlier this idea of like the algorithm kind of craves consistency. So planning like release schedules or like giving yourself like a buffer before you start releasing stuff can be really important. Like I have the first month, 2 months of comics like ready to go before I even actually start releasing. That way, there's less pressure to like I have to make all these comics right now, because you give yourself some wiggle room to still continue to get that kind of consistent output that you need to have to kind of stay in line with the algorithms and stuff like that, if you will. Other thoughts on that one, Jake? The kind of like avoiding burnout or release schedules?
Yeah, I've always found for myself that the further I am ahead, the easier it is to create. Because that burden of a self-imposed deadline or the deadline of keeping that consistency on social media, if you don't have that hanging over your head, your work will be much better. I definitely got in a rut, probably after we had started Lumberjackson, but in my early days of doing gag comics I would just go, and I would rush these comics, and the art would suffer. That's the other part of it, is that I started creating for a little bit, I was creating to post, not to create. And that ends up becoming evident. So by giving yourself that runway before you put anything out, you can keep the focus on the work itself.
Absolutely. And I think kind of going off your idea of like creating to create, I think this idea of like reading whatever comics or consuming whatever comics it is you're interested in is critical. I've heard people use this metaphor for writing where it's like if you're a writer and you're not really reading anything, it's like trying to drive your car without gas, because like you need to know what ideas are out there. You need to be thinking. Really, reading and writing are the same kind of thing. It's just a matter of making sure you're doing it and reading things that you want to read, not because like you have to or are forced to in that kind of way. So again, what I've listed here are just, I mean, some places you're probably familiar with, but if you're not, different places you can kind of go to like just find potentially new comics to see what's interesting to you and out there. And again, anything else, this is not like you have to be reading quote unquote the good comics or the great comics. You should be reading the comics that are interesting to you and connected to or related to the comics that you want to make. Because ultimately those two things are going to be very similar in that kind of way. All right. I think we have one last page of survival strategies, then it's just kind of resources and kind of a wrap up here. All right. I think the biggest thing as far as like continuing to do this is finding a community. Like finding people who are either also doing this or interested in doing it to like make sure that you can keep doing it. Because there is nothing worse than feeling like you're totally alone in this stuff. Some ways to do that, like just going to a local comic shop regularly. There's one up the road, not far up the road, Comics Are Go. There's also Carol and John's in Cleveland, which is, I just put that there because that's my local comic shop and I will plug them anytime I can. It's a great place. They have a cat. It's really cool. You can also find one close to you at comicshoplocator.com. There are also a lot of like local conventions you could go to. Like I listed a couple links to ones here as well. And or if you're ever on like either WEBTOON, Top, something like that, and you find creators that you like, joining on their Patreon or if they have Discord communities doing that, just kind of like start talking to people. Again, I think one of the best ways to keep your motivation up is to realize that like you're not alone in this. You're doing this with other people that are similarly interested in this kind of stuff. It can make you really want to continue coming back because you have an authentic reason to be like, oh, I'm working on this page. How is it similar to what you're working on? Just like talk to people about that in that sort of way. Jake and I actually met at a con, and that's kind of how we ended up working together and becoming friends. Is like we were at New York Comic Con a couple years back, and we're just like, there was a creator connection kind of networking opportunity, and we just met each other. Like, I like your style. You have a cool idea for a story. Let's try something together. And that's kind of just how it came about here. Any thoughts there, Jake, on the idea of like natural networking or finding community, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so for me, working on Live With Yourself, for instance, is that I had read the comic on WEBTOON. I saw the artist, Mercworks. Originally, this comic was originally created by Shen, but Mercworks had taken it over. And almost on a whim, I had joined his community. And in joining that, I learned so much. And naturally, over time, became friends with people. You know, it's important to go into this kind of thing, treating the other people as humans. Because if you're going into a community or somewhere just to like get what you can, or you know, suck up to people to get certain opportunities, they're going to see that from a mile away. You know, so it's surrounding yourself with the people whose work you admire, that you look up to, and that you genuinely want to learn from. Can go a long way in terms of making that natural connection with them. And a lot of artists are really open to sharing what they know and how they do it, because it's a good community to be a part of. And so through that natural networking, as being part of the Mercworks Discord and the Patreon, Dave had eventually asked me to come on and help out with the series.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of like, this is maybe kind of hokey and cheesy, but I think it's true. Like, there is a double benefit to this, right? Because this kind of stuff, like you said, you were part of this community, you were learning things, you were meeting people, and like you were growing as an artist, but you also were just like making relationships with people. And there was like a value in that inherently. Like, even if you, like I said, you didn't get this opportunity, you still have that community of people that you like know and can talk to in that kind of way. So like there is a dual benefit to like just kind of being a decent person and talking to other people about what you like, what you're interested in doing here. Cool. The last two slides, I'm just going to kind of breeze through because ultimately they're just kind of resources as far as like books, other things, programs we use, that kind of stuff, as well as like our personal websites and our own like Discord, Jake and I's like Discord chat, which again, if you ever have questions, concerns, that comes up, again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint slide. Feel free to hit us up, pop on there, ask a question. We'd be happy to kind of help you with that sort of stuff. I think, Jake, unless you have any last words, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and kind of jump to questions here. But do you have any last final thoughts here, Jake?
I hope some of you decide to go ahead and start making comics. You know, like Johnny said, like especially even in the self-publishing route in the beginning, it's incredibly fun to create, and to be able to tell stories with the use of words and pictures. It's a really unique art form, and it truly is. It's my favorite thing to create. I find myself having trouble drawing stuff that's not for comics anymore, because that narrative aspect of it is really what inspires me.
Yeah. I just want to kind of, my last thought here, jumping off of Jake's, is I think my thing is similar. Comics are my favorite thing to make because I write a lot of fiction. And I think I was telling Don about this last week when we met. Like, I write a lot of fiction, and it's a very like solitary act, and I have communities I'm a part of, but it's still like when I'm writing fiction by myself, right? Comics, because I can't draw, I can't do that. I need to run ideas past somebody. I need to bounce ideas off, and we can like create things together that are way better than what I could think of just by myself. And that like collaborative nature, I think, is something that I really, really enjoy about the whole process of this. So thank you all so much again for your time and attention. If you have any questions, feel free to kind of hang out and ask them, and we'll kind of go from there. All right. Cool. Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.